I once believed that when love was real, it could survive anything: distance, silence, even time itself. My name is Seraphine, and for 6 years I called a small wooden house on the edge of Dustwater my home. Daniel, my husband, built that house with his own hands. Every beam, every nail, carried the promise of forever. We lived quietly, just two souls, and the sound of the desert wind brushing against our windows at dusk. He was kind, once. The sort of man who smiled with his eyes, who brought home wildflowers, even when the land was dry and unyielding. I used to watch him from the porch, thinking that if the world ever turned its back on me, his shadow would still be there, steady, warm, and unbroken. But love, I've learned, doesn't vanish all at once. It fades the way daylight surrenders to dusk slowly, then suddenly. Lately, his letters stopped coming. His voice, when it did return, carried the chill of distance. The man who used to hold my hand through storms now spoke as if each word weighed too much. I tried to brush it aside, told myself every marriage had its quiet seasons. Yet, the way he looked at me before leaving last spring, as if memorizing something he no longer wanted to keep, left a crack in my chest. Still, I waited. I baked his favorite bread. I kept his coat by the door, believing he'd need it when he came home again. Faith can make fools of us, but it can also be the only thing that keeps us breathing. Then, one evening, the wind carried the sound of hooves. 2 horses, not one. I remember stepping out, apron still on, as the sun bled its last light over the horizon. Daniel dismounted first, and beside him stood a woman, young, glowing with the unmistakable curve of life beneath her dress. For a heartbeat, the world went quiet, the kind of silence that hums before thunder. His eyes met mine, and I saw no trace of the man I once knew, only a stranger who had come home carrying a truth I wasn't meant to bear. I didn't know it then, but that peaceful evening, the smell of bread, the golden light, the ache in my chest, was the beginning of everything that would soon fall apart. The next morning, the air in Dustwater was heavy with dust and whispers. I could feel it before I saw him, that slow dread curling at the edge of my heart. Daniel came to the market square, boots echoing against the dry earth. I thought he had come to speak to me in private, but no, he wanted an audience. He took my arm, firm enough to leave a mark, and pulled me into the center of the square. Faces turned. The butcher paused mid-cut. The baker's wife froze with flour on her hands. I could feel every stare, sharp as broken glass. And then he spoke. "This," he said, pointing to the woman beside him, Lila, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly, "is what a real woman looks like. 6 months, and she's carrying my child. Something Seraphine could never do." The words fell like stones into a well, heavy, final, echoing deep inside me. I didn't cry. I didn't move. The murmurs rose around me, a low storm of pity and judgment. Someone laughed. Someone gasped. The world blurred until all I could see was sunlight reflecting off a tin water pail, bright, cruel, and cold. In that moment, I understood how humiliation could feel like being stripped of your skin. Not by hands, but by words. He waited for me to speak, to plead, to crumble. But all I said quietly, like a prayer only the wind could carry, was this: "Sometimes, the one who cannot give you a child is the only one who could have saved you from your own sin." A silence fell, sharp and breathless. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then he laughed, short, bitter, and empty, and turned away. Lila followed him, her eyes flickering between pride and unease. The crowd slowly scattered, leaving only footprints and the echo of what had been said. I stood there until the sun slipped behind the church spire. My shadow stretched long across the dirt, thin as a ghost that no longer belonged to anyone. I didn't cry. I only felt hollow like ashes after the fire has burned everything it ever loved. After that morning in the square, Dustwater changed its breath around me. The people still spoke my name, but never to my face. They whispered it the way one mentions a ghost, softly, cautiously, as if afraid I might appear and remind them of something they didn't want to see. I moved through those days like a shadow. I still swept the porch, fed the chickens, baked bread that no one would eat but me. Life has a strange way of continuing, even when your heart no longer does. At night, I'd lie awake beside the empty side of our bed. the smell of his cologne fading like smoke after rain. And I'd wonder, what makes a man forget love so completely? Is it pride, desire, or the need to destroy what once reminded him of his better self? The question haunted me. But the answer, I already knew it, even if I didn't want to face it. You see, long before that humiliation, there was another story between Daniel and me, a quieter one, sealed behind the closed door of a doctor's office in the city. It was a spring 2 years ago when I sat beside him in that white room. The doctor spoke softly, his hands folded like he was about to deliver a prayer instead of truth. He said there was nothing wrong with me. My body was whole, capable, strong. The problem, he explained gently, was Daniel's. Something about numbers too low, cells that couldn't live long enough. Words like infertility and impossibility floated in the air like ashes. Daniel didn't speak all the way home. He just stared out the window as the fields blurred past, his hands clenched until the knuckles went white. That night, he burned the papers. Said he didn't believe in the word of men who pretend to play God. I never mentioned it again. I thought silence would protect him, that if I bore his shame in secret, love might find its way back through kindness. But silence, I've learned, is like water left too long in a well. It turns still, and then it begins to rot. After that day in the market, my silence began to suffocate me. Each rumor that reached my door was a blade twisting where my pride used to live. They said Daniel was preparing a wedding, that Lila's child would bear his name, his legacy. Every word was a thorn, but I didn't bleed anymore. I was beyond that. I was waiting for what, I wasn't sure. Maybe for the truth to find its own voice. One evening, as the wind picked up and the sky turned the color of iron, I saw the doctor again. He had come through Dustwater for supplies, passing through on his way north. When he saw me outside the post office, he stopped, his face pale with recognition. "Mrs. Ward," he said quietly, tipping his hat. "I've been meaning to send you a letter. About your husband. And the tests. It seems he never returned for confirmation." My breath caught. "He wouldn't have," I said softly. "He burned everything." The doctor looked down, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "I kept the records. I thought you might need them someday." His words lingered in the air, heavy as prophecy. I took the envelope, but I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't always have to be read sometimes. It's enough to feel its weight in your hand. That night, I sat by the window, watching the storm roll over the desert. Lightning lit the sky in quick, furious flashes, and for a moment, I saw my reflection in the glass. My face pale, tired, older than I remembered, looked back at me like a stranger's. The envelope lay on the table, untouched. I could have torn it open, could have marched into town and screamed Daniel's secret for the world to hear, but I didn't. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath all the anger and ache, I still loved him. Or maybe I just loved the memory of who he used to be, the man who brought home wildflowers when the world was cruel. Love can be crueler than hate, because it remembers. Weeks passed, the town buzzed with talk of the coming birth. Daniel built a new fence behind Lila's cabin, hammering through the afternoons with the urgency of a man building walls against his own guilt. I watched from a distance, unseen. Sometimes Lila would come into the market, her hands resting protectively over her belly. People would smile at her, the way they once smiled at me. I noticed her eyes wide, nervous, never meeting anyone's gaze for too long. There was something in them that reminded me of a trapped bird, all flutter, no flight. And then one day, as I passed her near the well, our eyes met, just for a heartbeat. In that brief silence, I saw it the flicker of fear, the shadow of deceit. It wasn't just guilt, it was terror. That was when I understood. The child she carried might not be Daniel's after all. I didn't speak. I didn't accuse. The truth, I knew, had a way of surfacing like oil on water, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. All I had to do was wait. That night, I placed the unopened envelope beneath a loose floorboard, beside an old locket and a pressed wildflower Daniel once gave me. 3 relics of a love that had lived, burned, and turned to smoke. As the wind howled outside, I whispered to the dark, "You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the truth just waits patient as dawn, certain as dust." And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the kind of calm that comes when you stop running from what you already know. The night stretched on, full of wind and memory. I fell asleep to the sound of rain against the window, and in my dream, the doctor's envelope glowed faintly beneath the floor, a small, silent ember of everything that was still to come. It happened on a night when the wind refused to rest. The desert sky was swollen with clouds, and the air carried that uneasy stillness before rain when even the coyotes go silent. I had been awake for hours, mending an old shawl by the lantern's light, when I heard the pounding on my door. "Mrs. Ward!" It was Martha, the midwife from the next ranch. Her breath came in sharp bursts. "It's Lila. The baby's coming too soon. Daniel sent me to fetch supplies. He says he needs help." For a moment, I couldn't move. Her words hung between us like smoke. Then, almost without thinking, I stood and reached for the basket that once held herbs, linens, and oil things I hadn't touched since the day my hope for motherhood was buried. When I stepped outside, the wind whipped my hair loose, carrying the taste of iron and sand. The lantern Martha held flickered wildly, a small, trembling flame in a sea of dark. Lila's cabin stood near the river bend, its windows glowing dimly through the storm. I could hear her cries before I reached the door, raw, human, primal, the sound of life fighting its way into the world, or death refusing to let go. Inside, the air was thick with heat and fear. Daniel knelt by the bed, his hands shaking, his shirt stained with sweat. His eyes met mine for the first time in months, eyes I had once trusted to guide me through anything. Now they looked lost, desperate, almost pleading. "Seraphine," he said hoarsely. I didn't know who else. I didn't answer. There were no words left that could save him. Lila writhed in pain, gripping the blanket, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Martha gave me a quick nod, the kind only women who have lived through too much can share. Together we worked, quiet and steady, through the storm's roar. Hours blurred into moments. The room pulsed with the rhythm of thunder, the flicker of lamplight, the sharp scent of blood. And then, at last, a cry, small, thin, alive. But something was wrong. I could see it the moment Martha lifted the child into her arms. Daniel leaned forward, tears spilling freely, until the light caught the newborn's hair, a deep copper red, glinting even in the dimness. The color struck like lightning. It wasn't Daniel's. It couldn't be. His lineage was dark-haired, as was Lila's. Every man and woman in the ward line bore that same shadow hue, proud, unmistakable. But this was flame. The midwife's face went still. She turned the baby toward the lamp, her eyes narrowing. On the infant's shoulder bloomed a pale birthmark, shaped like a crescent, the same mark known across Dustwater as belonging to the Roth brothers, ranch hands who had left town that spring. Daniel's face drained of color. He staggered backward, his hand catching the edge of the table. The jar of oil fell and shattered, spreading slick across the floorboards. Lila began to sob, not from pain but from something far deeper, a sorrow that sounded like confession. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean he said he'd never tell." Daniel's voice came out broken. "Whose child?" Her words dissolved into weeping. The thunder outside answered for her. For a long time no one moved. Only the storm spoke, wind howling through the cracks, rain beating against the roof like 1,000 accusing hands. Then Daniel turned to me. His eyes were wide, uncomprehending, as if the world had suddenly emptied beneath him. For a moment, I thought he might speak, might beg, might rage, might crumble into something human again. But he didn't. He just stood there, frozen, his face pale as ash. And that was when I felt it, not triumph, not relief, but an aching stillness inside me. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't roar, it whispers. Martha placed the baby in Lila's trembling arms, then looked at me. I nodded once, then turned toward the door. My hands were steady, though my heart wasn't. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest. It washed the dust from the porch, the blood from my palms, the weight from my shoulders. Behind me, I heard Daniel call my name once, softly, as though he still believed I might come back, but I kept walking. The sound of his voice faded into the storm, swallowed by thunder and distance. By the time I reached my own doorstep, dawn was beginning to stretch across the horizon, thin ribbons of light breaking through the clouds. The desert smelled clean again, almost forgiving. I stood there for a long time, watching the horizon blush with morning. Somewhere far behind me, a baby cried. Life had found its way, but not where it was expected to. Inside, the house was cold. I placed the lantern on the table and noticed the faint glow beneath the floorboard where I had hidden the doctor's envelope. I thought of digging it up, of burning it as Daniel once did, but I didn't. Some truths deserve to remain not as revenge, but as remembrance. I poured myself a cup of coffee, dark and bitter. As I drank, I caught my reflection in the window again. This time, I didn't see the ghost of a forsaken woman. I saw someone reborn not into joy, but into peace. And in that fragile silence after the storm, I whispered not to Daniel, not to Lila, but to the version of myself that once believed love was forever. You were wrong, my dear. Love dies. But dignity survives even after the last ember fades. The rain eased into a soft drizzle. The light grew stronger. And though I knew the road ahead would be empty, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid to walk it alone. When the storm passed, Dustwater woke to a silence so deep it felt like a held breath. The air was washed clean, but the town itself carried a new kind of stain, not one the rain could touch. News travels faster than truth out here. By the next morning everyone knew. The butcher's boy whispered it over his cart. The preacher's wife told it between hymns. And the story spread how Daniel Ward's proud name had fallen, how the woman he paraded as proof of his manhood had given birth to another man's child. I didn't step outside that day. I didn't need to. The world always finds a way to deliver what it wants you to hear. Through the cracks of my window came laughter, sharp and thin as broken glass. Not cruel, exactly just the kind of laughter people use when they're afraid of becoming what they mock. I stood by the table, hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, and watched the dust settle where Daniel's boots once stood. The silence was strange, not empty, but full of echoes. I realized then that pain doesn't always leave when the cause of it does. It lingers like smoke, tracing the outlines of everything that burned. That evening, I saw him for the last time. He came up the path as the sun bled gold across the hills. His hat was gone, his clothes still damp from rain. For a moment, he looked like the man I had once loved, weary, human, lost. He stopped by the gate, unsure if he was welcome. "Seraphine," he said, his voice rough from sleepless nights. "I didn't know who else to see." I said nothing. The wind moved between us, dry and cool. "I was wrong," he whispered, "about everything." I looked at him then, not with anger, but with the tired clarity that comes when there's nothing left to break. "It's a strange thing," I said softly, "how a lie can live longer than love." He nodded, eyes shining in the fading light. "I thought I was building a family," he murmured. "But all I built was a grave for my own peace." The words hung in the air, fragile and final. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't offer it. Some distances are too wide for words to cross. When he turned and walked away, I felt no triumph, no revenge. Only the stillness of release like an arrow that's finally stopped flying. That night, Dustwater was quieter than I had ever known it. Even the crickets seemed to have run out of things to say. I lit a single candle and placed it by the window. Its flame wavered, soft and steady, painting light across the walls like a promise I hadn't made but somehow kept. I took out the envelope the doctor had given me the truth that had waited in silence. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. The words were, as I remembered, the numbers, the diagnosis, the gentle phrasing meant to soften what couldn't be softened. For the first time, I didn't feel pity. I felt understanding. Daniel wasn't cruel because he hated me. He was cruel because he hated himself. And I had loved him through all of it, not out of weakness, but out of a kind of faith that belonged to another life. I folded the letter again and placed it beneath the candle. The wax dripped slowly onto the paper, sealing it like an old wound closing. Outside, the wind carried faint voices, laughter, gossip, the endless hum of a town moving on. People would talk for a while, and then they'd find new stories, new sins to weigh. Dustwater was built on that kind of forgetting. As for me, I began to live in the small ways that mattered. I planted sage in the yard. I painted the porch rail. I mended old curtains and let the light in again. Each morning, I woke to the sound of wind through the mesquite trees, not the sound of emptiness, but of space. space to breathe, to rebuild, to exist without apology. Sometimes, I'd pass the river where Lila once fetched water. I never saw her again, but I left wildflowers there each spring. Not forgiveness, exactly more like closure offered to the silence. One evening, as the sky turned the color of old copper, Martha stopped by. She didn't say much, just sat beside me on the porch, sipping tea. After a while, she said, "You've got strength in you, Seraphine. Not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need witnesses." I smiled faintly. Maybe strength is just what's left when everything else is gone. We sat there until the stars came out, listening to the desert breathe, and for the first time I realized I no longer flinched when the night grew too quiet. Because quiet no longer meant loneliness. It meant peace. As I went to bed, I thought of Daniel somewhere out there carrying his own ghost through the long miles of the frontier. Maybe someday he'd find the man he once promised to be. Maybe not. But either way, I knew this much. His story had ended where mine had begun again. Before sleep took me, I whispered into the dark a prayer, a farewell, or maybe both. The world breaks what it must, but if we're lucky, it leaves us with the pieces worth keeping. Oh, and as the wind slipped through the cracks of my window, it carried no sorrow this time, only the quiet song of something finally set free. It's strange how silence becomes a kind of companion once you stop fearing it. After Daniel left, the house no longer echoed with footsteps or arguments, or the rustle of two lives colliding in one space. It just breathed slowly, softly like an old creature learning to rest again. In the first weeks, I moved carefully, as though any sudden sound might awaken ghosts I wasn't ready to face. The bed looked wider, the walls emptier, but the light came in different now. It didn't fall across his coat or the chair where he used to sit. It filled the corners that had long been hidden, touching even the places grief had tried to keep dark. That's when I began to write. At first, it was only small things, the color of the morning, the smell of rain, the hum of bees among the sage. I didn't know if I was writing to someone or from someone, but it felt like setting my heart out to dry after years of being left in the storm. Today the wind came from the south. The hills looked almost kind. "I am still here." That was the first line I ever put down in the journal. Simple, awkward, but honest. I didn't realize then how much those pages would save me. Each night, I would light a candle, sit by the window, and write until the wax ran low. Words became a kind of prayer not for forgiveness, but for understanding. I wrote about the girl I had been when I first came to Dustwater, the woman I became when love turned cruel, and the stranger I was now, someone rebuilding herself from quiet and dust. Through the window, the desert stretched endlessly, the horizon bleeding into the sky. It reminded me of my own heart, scarred, yes, but wide open. One evening, I found the old locket Daniel had given me, the one with a pressed wildflower inside. It had turned brown, brittle with time, but still held its shape. I pressed it between the pages of my journal, beside a note that read, "Some things die, but not their meaning." That night, I slept without dreams. Days passed like pages turning. I learned the rhythm of solitude, when to work, when to rest, when to let the world in. There was peace in the small rituals, boiling coffee at dawn, hanging laundry in the sun, brushing dust from the porch. One morning, I walked to the edge of town. The people of Dustwater still looked, still whispered, but softer now, as if guilt had replaced curiosity. I didn't mind, their stories no longer touched me. I had my own now, and it was enough. Martha sometimes visited, bringing honey or bread. We'd sit on the porch and talk about weather, crops, or nothing at all. She told me once that strength wasn't about how much you can carry, but about knowing when to set something down. I didn't answer, but I thought about it long after she left. That evening, I opened my journal again. I used to think the opposite of love was hate. I wrote, "But it's not, it's clarity." The words surprised me, but they felt true. Hate still binds you to what hurt you. Clarity sets you free. As the seasons turned, the garden began to grow wild. Sage spread along the fence, and yellow primrose found its way through cracks in the stone path. I let them. They belonged, even in their untamed way. Perhaps I did too. Sometimes, when the sun sank low and the sky turned copper, I'd hear a faraway horse on the trail, a faint rhythm fading into distance. I never went to the window to look. Some things are better left unseen. Closure doesn't always come as a door shutting. Sometimes it's just the sound of hooves disappearing over the horizon. One evening, after weeks of silence, I took out the envelope again, the one from the doctor, still sealed in wax and truth. I placed it beside my journal. Then, without opening it, I wrote one final entry for the night. The truth is no longer mine to carry. It has already done its work. And I burned the envelope in the hearth. The flame was brief, almost tender. It didn't feel like erasing, it felt like release. When the ashes cooled, I carried them outside and let the wind take them across the fields. The sky was deep indigo, scattered with stars, tiny, defiant lights that refused to be swallowed by night. I whispered into the air, "We are all just stories trying to make peace with their endings." For the first time, I believed it. Now, each dawn feels like a clean page. I still write not because I need to remember, but because I finally can. My words are lighter now, shaped not by sorrow, but by gratitude. Gratitude that I endured, that I learned to listen to the quiet, that I discovered who I am when no one is watching. And in the hush before morning, when the first light spills across the desert, I close my journal, run my fingers over its worn leather cover, and smile. The house breathes with me steady, alive. And I know, deep in my bones, that even the loneliest heart can find its way back to itself, one word, one dawn, one tender silence at a time. Morning comes differently now. It doesn't rush in like it used to. It arrives softly, brushing light across my face as if testing whether I'm ready for another day. I used to wake in fear of silence. Now I wake with it, like an old friend who knows when not to speak. The desert beyond my porch glows gold under the Sunday. The wind drifts through the sage and hums against the windows a low, steady note that sounds almost like forgiveness. I sit with my journal on my lap, the pages half filled, the rest waiting. I once thought my life had ended. I write, but it was only shedding its skin. I think of Daniel sometimes not with anger, not even with longing, but with a quiet kind of gratitude. He was both the wound and the reason I learned how to heal. Without him, I might never have discovered that dignity isn't something another person can give or take. It's what remains when everything else is gone. The town still speaks my name, but their words no longer reach me. Let them talk. Stories change with each telling, and I have no need to correct them. The truth is simpler. I was broken, and I learned how to stand again. Sometimes, at dusk, I walk to the ridge above Dustwater. From there, the horizon looks endless, a ribbon of fire melting into sky. The air tastes of dust and freedom. The old me would have looked at that horizon and seen emptiness. Now I see a road not leading away from the past, but through it. The world doesn't owe us mercy, I whisper to the wind, but it offers it anyway, in the smallest things: a sunrise, a quiet breath, the strength to keep walking. When the sun begins to fall, the sky burns in shades of copper and rose. Shadows stretch long, and for a moment, I almost feel the pulse of life beneath my feet, the land itself forgiving, the air alive with second chances. I close my journal and rise. My hands, once trembling, now steady. My heart, once shattered, beats clear and slow. I take one last look at the horizon and smile, not because I've forgotten, but because I've remembered enough. Then I whisper, to the wind, to the light, to whoever might be listening, I am not what happened to me. I am what I chose to become. And as I walk back toward the small wooden house that once held my sorrow, the wind follows me like a hymn, gentle, endless, free.